The poem we are reading today is Ozymandias, a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley. And perhaps at this point I should ask you to stop the playing and read the poem, which you will find posted underneath, in the box underneath. You might have to scroll down to find it. And also to look in Google Images for the image of Ozymandias. This is an ekphrastic poem. It's describing an object, if you will, of art. It's a statue of which the poet is referring to an antique, if you will, found in Egypt in an antique land and brought to the British Museum, where you can still see it to this day. And the poet is gazing at this statue and reading into this statue what he reads in, how he understands. With that said, I'm going to begin to read the poem and comment. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level stands stretch far away. Repeating the last lines. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, of course, from a Jewish standpoint, right away we say, well, Ozymandias, I've never heard that name before, but this sounds like the antique land was Egypt. And if you're familiar with the number of artifacts brought from Egypt and housed in the British Museum today, so then you would be correct. That's where you will find this artifact, this statue, this large statue, which is only a small part of the statue. And you might say, well, good, who is this person? And then you begin to research it a little bit. You'll find out that he's generally assumed to be, Ozymandias is the Greek for Ramses. In fact, Ramses II, who is arguably the Paro of the Exodus, the Paro that Moshe Rabbeinu is approaching and saying, Shalach ami, let my people go. And we could take what the poet sees in the visage and in the heart, if you will, of this Paro and translate it, read it back into this is actually, as it were, a photograph as close as we can get, which would somehow indicate the character of the Paro that we know from Shmot. And indeed, perhaps the nature of every Paro. However, I don't want to go into that. I want to talk about this in terms of what we might learn as far as ourselves. And so we begin with the Rambam, Maimonides, in Hilchot Deot, in the laws of character traits, of virtue. And in the second chapter, the Rambam, who generally takes the position across the board that when it comes to virtue and character traits, we should be adopting what we can call the middle path, the derech hayashar, the exact middle, right? Neither too much of this or too much of that. Neither profligate in our spending of money nor a miser. Okay, somewhere in the middle of all virtues, and therefore in the way we relate. These are called hilchot deot. However, there are two exceptions. And the primary exception of the two, they are anger and humility. The primary exception of the two, if you do a careful reading in the Rambam, in the second chapter of Hilchot Deot, the Rambam says in the third halacha, V'yesh deot, there are certain character traits, she'asur lo la'adam linhog bahem b'beiniyut. A person is forbidden to live the life of the middle path. El yidrachek min hakatzeh, but you have to go from one extreme to the other extreme. And the first example, and the primary example, is that it is not enough that a person should be merely an anav, merely humble. It's not enough to be merely humble, which is, according to the Rambam, the midpoint that in this character trait is to be humble. But it's not enough to be merely humble. El shieh shval ruach rucho v'yehei nemucha ma'od. He should be exceedingly humble, and so on and so forth. The Rambam says, and that is why it is said of Moshe Rabbeinu, Lefichach nemar b'Moshe Rabbeinu, Onov me'od, v'lo nemar onov bilvad. V'ish Moshe, we find in the Torah, V'ish Moshe, can you imagine Moshe having to write this? V'ish Moshe onov. But onov is the way we're all supposed to be. Onov me'od. He reached the height of humility, the height of being humble, because he was onov me'od, not a trace whatsoever of ga'ava, of arrogance. Now, this insistence, on the one hand you have, if you will, Paro, represented in the poem, arrogant beyond arrogant, and on the other hand you have Moshe, who is onov me'od. This trait is already perhaps indicated in the first two stories we'll have of the human condition in the world. After all, if we look at the sin of the Eitz Hadat, the sin of the Eitz Hadat, of the tree of knowledge, was the desire, was the striving of the human to be more than human, to be God, seduced by the snake, by the inner desires that we have. It's not enough. We have to reign supreme. Ve'yitem kelokim. You will be as God, Yodei Tov V'Ra. And this is the challenge of man, to accept limitations, to understand that there is God and there is man. And in the face of God, in the presence of God, anav ma'od is demanded. Very, very humble. And since we have to live a life which is integrated, anav ma'od mikal ha'adam, from others as well, we stand in anivut. And once again, what is the second sin? I say that if the first sin is that man wanted to be as God, as Rashi says, Yotzrei Olamot, creators of worlds, they learned that they can't be creators of worlds. But what Cain in the second sin learned was that he can be, if not the creator of worlds, the destroyer of worlds. But where does it come from? It comes from jealousy, from not wanting to be, if you will, in some way less than in your own eyes, that Hevel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's is not. And that wanting to be more than, not being satisfied with being the best that I can, unless where I am better than everybody else in some way, leads to the second sin, in which man is not the creator of worlds, but the destroyer of worlds. This issue of our human condition, which pushes us to want to be the one who does it all, the one who is worth everything, beyond everything, even beyond God, is something. This week's parsha happens to be Akev, and which appears at the beginning of this week's parsha. God tells us that we are going to Eretz Yisrael, and this is a wonderful land. We get everything that God is giving us. And we come across the pasuk, V'achalta v'savata uveirachta et Hashem Elokecha. You will eat, you will be sated, and you will bless God for giving you this land. Wow, what a gift. And I bless God in thanks for that gift. And this is the source of brachot. This is a bracha of when we eat. Well, Birkat HaMazon is the Torah obligation of saying a bracha. But there is a danger. And the danger comes immediately afterwards. Hishamer lecha. Be very diligent and careful. Pen tishkach et Hashem Elokecha. Lest you forget God, because you will come into this land and eventually you will say, Kochi ve'otzem yodi asuli et hachayil hazeh. It's the power of my own hand. Ve'ram levavecha ve'shachachto et Hashem Elokecha. Your heart will become lifted up. You will become exalted in your own eyes, and you will forget Hashem Elokecha, who took you out of Mitzrayim and brought you through the desert. V'amarto bilvavecha, and you will say, Kochi v'otzem yodi asuli et hachayil hazeh. That's the danger. And from here we see that the meaning of saying a bracha is what we are doing in order to guard ourselves from saying, it's I who did it. When we forget the trait of anivut, of humility, of dependence upon God. In prayer, how do we wake up every day? How do we wake up every day? Modeh ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam. I stand before you in my waking state. I stand before you, God, and I give thanks, and I admit that you are the source of everything. Modeh ani lefanecha. And I recognize as I go on in another part of tefillah, beautiful part of tefillah, a beautiful part of tefillah. I speak about the reality, and I say, Ma'anu mechayenu, what are we? What is our lives? Halo kol hagiborim, the powerful people are ka'ayin lefanecha. The anshe are like nothing before you. The anshe Hashem kelo hayu, and famous men as if they were not. Right? But what do we treasure? That we are your people. But we alone have to be careful that we not think, I'm powerful, whatever I am. Anshe Hashem k'lai hayu. Very, very famous people. Imagine if you got up this morning and, as people are wont to do, they wanted to know how they were doing in the world, and they Googled themselves, and they didn't appear on Google. They're wiped out, as if they were never famous people. Kelo hayu, right? However, aval anachnu amcha b'nei britecha, What does it mean? What does it mean to have the Torah? What does it mean to be able to stand in humility before God and before others? This humility that we stand before God, of course, and others, is, of course, if you have the humility, then you'll have another character trait. And that character trait is the character trait not of sympathy. I think I've talked about this before in these broadcasts, in these YouTubes, but not sympathy for the other, but empathy, to really feel others. And you can't really feel others if you don't have empathy. And Reb Chaim of Volozhin tells his son, and you will find this in the introduction by his son to the classic work of his father, Reb Chaim of Volozhin, Nefesh HaChaim, who says, "V'haya ragil lochiach oti." My father was regularly reproved me or instructed me, al shera'a sheneni mishtateif b'tzara da'achrine, because he saw that I wasn't participating in the pain of the others. Not that his son, Reb Yitzchak of Volozhin, was not acting in sympathy, but he didn't feel it. Mishtateif b'tzara da'achrine. V'ho hayo hayad dvaro elai tamid. And this is what he said to me always. Shezeh kol ha'adam lo la'atzmo nivra. Man, the entirety of man was not created for himself. Rak lahoil la'achrine b'chol asher yimtza b'kocho lasos. But to help others in everything that he could do. That's the meaning of life. And any mishtateif, it's not enough just to do things. We have to be things. We have to live in a certain way, in action and internally in virtue. We have to write the Torah on the parchment of the Sefer Torah, and we have to write the Torah al levavecha, the Targum Yonasan, al luach libachon, on the tabula engraved in the heart. This character of Anav, is we find Moshe. We find Moshe Rabbeinu, and this comes at the end of Parshas Kisisa, when Moshe comes down from the mountain with the second luchot, okay, Karan or Pnei Moshe, his face shone. What does this mean? What is the shining? And there is an Orach Chaim HaKadosh on this, who quotes a midrash that when Moshe was writing the Sefer Torah, after he had finished writing the Sefer Torah, there was a little bit of ink left in the quill, and he didn't know what to do with it. So what did he do? Kshekatav Moshe HaTorah nishtayer mikulmus bekulmus kima veheviro al rosho. He took the quill and he put the ink on his head. A little bit, right? A little bit. Kima, right? And that's where the rays of light shone from his, right? And the Orach Chaim says these are words that are very difficult to understand. And he offers an explanation. He says that there is no trait higher than humility. And Moshe Rabbeinu, instructed to write the Torah, God spelling out the words. When he was told to write Va'ish Moshe, the man Moses was anav me'od, was exceedingly humble. He had a problem. How could he write like that? He was humble. But how could he? In other words, God told him. And God said, anav, as it were, spelled it out, ayin, nun, and to write it in its fullest sense with a yud, which makes no difference from the way we pronounce it, but it's there, fully, completely, totally, incomparably humble. And Moshe Rabbeinu did not write the yud. This is an amazing interpretation. Amazing. as if the Sefer Torah, I mean, I'm just, saying the point, as if it were pasul, because Moshe didn't want to write the Anav. But Moshe Rabbeinu understood something. And he understood something, that in not writing the Yud, in putting it on his forehead, because there was a little ink left, that ink was left because he didn't write the Yud, that there is something else God wants from us. And that is to write, to inscribe, to engrave the Torah. The entirety of the Torah is not possible because of the missing Yud, because Moshe understood something and he internalized the Torah. He put it on himself. A person has to become Torah. And that's the Anav Ma'od. That is the Anav Ma'od that Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us. So in the famous story of Zushya that I'm sure you all know, who on his deathbed says, is crying, and the Hasidim say, why? And he says, I'm not, if they ask me why I wasn't Moshe, why I wasn't like Moshe, I'm not like Moshe. If they ask me why I wasn't the Baal Shem Tov, I'm not the Baal Shem Tov. But if I'm asked why wasn't I Zushya, we are asked to be the best we can be and to remain Anav Ma'od. V'chein Yehi Ratzon.